you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, first let me thank my good friend Tom Siebel, in fact, the Siebels, for this wonderful institution, the Siebel Scholars. The Siebel Foundation does so much good in the world, but in listening to Tom describe the Siebel Scholars and how they now are all spreading out to infiltrate governments around the world, I'm just certain that you're going to do even more. I am indeed glad to join you from Stanford University. Tom is right. I've been at Stanford now 31 years. Stanford hired me when I was 11, obviously, and it's been a great run at Stanford. But I'm delighted to join this wonderful collection of young people and their friends who I'm sure will make a very big difference. As I was looking at the subject matter of your conference, it occurred to me that we're going through a period in the international system in which many of the concepts, many of the ideas that have formed the core of how the United States of America thinks about its own democracy are, in fact, playing out across the world and being questioned across the world. Indeed, if you look at what's going on in what has been called the Arab Spring, I think this may be one of the most fundamental changing events in human history, because it once again demonstrates that the concept of freedom, the concept that no man, woman, or child should have to live in tyranny, is indeed a universal concept. I have been talking about a subject from time to time called Why Democracy Matters, and I've said that it's a little odd that a former Secretary of State of the United States would have to go around talking about why democracy matters. But indeed, there have been so many arguments about why democracy is limited to a particular people. It's almost as if there have been arguments from time to time that there are simply people who do not have the DNA for democracy. We used to argue that at one time about Latin Americans. They preferred juntas to freedom. We argued about Africans. They were too tribal to engage in freedom. There was even a time when for black people, they were, in the United States, they were too childlike to care about freedom. And what we're seeing in the streets of the Middle East is, again, that authoritarianism is not stable, because ultimately men, women, and children yearn for the desire to be able to say what they think, to worship as they please, to be free from the knock of the secret police at night, and most importantly, to be able to have the dignity that comes with having those who would wish to govern you have to ask for your consent. Now, freedom, which is indeed exploding in the streets of the Middle East, is a first step. But we all know that freedom and democracy are related to one another, but they are not the same thing. Freedom must be institutionalized in documents like constitutions, rule of law, if indeed you are to move to democracy. If in fact men and women are able to exercise those rights, the right to say what you think, to worship as you please, to be free from the knock of the secret police at night, you have to have rule of law, and you have to have recourse in order to exercise your rights. Often, these rights are enshrined in constitutions, and while it is true that at the first stage of the enshrinement in constitutions, they may simply be something on paper, never underestimate the power of the actual enshrinement of those rights in institutions and in constitutions. Let me just give you an example of why it's such an important step. When Martin Luther King wanted to say that segregation was wrong in my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama, he did not have to say that the United States had to be something else. He only had to say that the United States had to be what it said it was. That is a much more powerful way from which to advocate for one's rights, if indeed they are enshrined de jure in constitutions, in rule of law, even if in fact they are not yet fully accepted by the entire society and in the norms of the society. And so the institutionalization of freedom into democratic institutions is the next great step. But mature democracies recognize that the institutionalization of freedom into democracy, that is, those important documents that enshrine rights, are not yet still the full story of how democracies become very stable. Mature democracies require something more. They require an understanding among the citizenry that one man, one vote cannot mean tyranny of the majority. And so, if there is no tyranny of the majority, then the rights, the responsibility to minorities to make sure that those rights are respected is also a part of the fabric of the democracy. But perhaps most importantly, the most stable democracies are ones that recognize that the strong cannot exploit the weak. And therein, I think, lies the basis of the discussion of what you will be talking about this weekend. What do we mean when we talk about class? Class inequality, class as dispositive in where one will end up in life. What is the role of class in democratic development? Now, it may surprise some of you that I used to teach Marx and Marxism as a part of what I did. I was, after all, a Soviet specialist. I have read Karl Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, the last three in the original Russian. And something that was very interesting about all of those arguments was that class was seen as something that was a permanent place of identification, indeed, the most important element of identification. When Karl Marx said, "Workers of the world unite," he really meant that the workers of Great Britain or the workers of Germany or the workers of France or of the United States had less in common with the ruling classes of those countries than they had with each other, because the most important descriptor that one could have was class. Indeed, everything else, Karl Marx said, was false consciousness. And so for the Marxist, class was everything. Now, if class is everything, though, in a democracy, that democracy will not last very long. And so the interesting question about the United States of America, about which you will be talking this week, is it has actually had its citizenry a very weak identification with class. Indeed, the great American unifying myth has been that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. You can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things. So class cannot possibly be the most important descriptor of who you are. If you can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things, then class is not a prison. Indeed, if you can come from humble circumstances and do great things, you also accept that anyone else in the society can come from humble circumstances and do great things. This has led people to come to the United States for generations from all over the world to be a part of that. It has meant that the United States has been the single greatest mobilizer of human potential in human history. People have come here, immigrants, from the poorest of countries to make $5, not 50 cents. And people have come here, like Sergey Brin, at 7 years old, from Russia with his parents, and founded Google. And so coming from all over the world, it has been because there's been a belief that you can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things. It doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. But the other great part of that bargain in the United States has not just been those who came here, but those who are here. And that, in a sense, is, I think, what is in question today. Is it still true that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going? And the greatest tool, the greatest weapon in breaking out of one's circumstances into different circumstances has always been access to high-quality education. So I would suggest that much of the discomfort much of the anxiety about whether or not indeed we are a mobile society, indeed you can come from humble circumstances and do great things, relates directly to globalization, the technological revolution, but most importantly to the state of education in the United States of America today. I'm a great believer in this because my family has been for a long time touched by the transforming power of education. You know, we all have our family heroes and we all have our family myths. Now, a myth isn't necessarily something that's untrue. It's just something that's a little outsized in your thinking. And in our family, this hero and this myth was embodied in my paternal grandfather, John Wesley Rice Sr. John Wesley Rice Sr. was a sharecropper's son in Utah. That would be E-U-T-A-W. I'm not kidding. Alabama. And when John Wesley Rice Sr. was a young man, sometime probably around 1919 or so, John Wesley Rice Sr. decided that he was going to get book learning in a college. And so he asked how a colored man could go to college. They told him that there was a little Presbyterian school about 30 miles from where he lived. It was called Stillman College, and he could go there. And so he saved up his cotton, and he went off to Stillman College. And after 1 year, they asked him how he was going to pay for his second year. He said he was out of cotton. They said he was out of luck. But thinking quickly, he asked, how are those boys going to college? And they said, well, you see, they have what's called a scholarship. And if you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, then you could have a scholarship too. My grandfather said, that is exactly what I had in mind. And my family has been college educated and Presbyterian ever since. But John Wesley Rice Sr. was on to something. He was on to the transforming power of education. And oh, by the way, he knew that that education would transform not just him, but generations of Rices. Indeed, my father would go on to become advanced degreed and would become a university administrator. And my Aunt Teresa would go to the University of Wisconsin in 1952 and become the first black woman to get a PhD in English literature, and she would write books on Dickens. John Wesley Rice Sr. knew that the transforming power of education doesn't stop at one generation, it passes from generation to generation to generation. And while I know that there are those who say, an education may not be worth as much as it once was, just consider this. Without an education, you are more greatly punished than you have ever been. In a day when I can look at your zip code and tell whether or not you're going to get a good education, it is actually very difficult to say it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. That, I think, is at the core of what America must do to maintain opportunity, to make certain that I can't look at your zip code and tell what your fate in life is going to be. If we fail to reform K-12 education and to make it accessible for all, we face three great threats to our democracy. First, we face the one that everyone thinks about when they think about a population that cannot attain the right skills for the 21st century. We face the threat of people who are unemployed, indeed unemployable, will live on the dole because they will have nowhere else to go, and cannot possibly contribute to the tremendous economic and technological revolution that is taking place. Indeed, our ability to mobilize human potential is compromised. Secondly, we, of course, have the threat that we will not be able to even fill our military forces. Do you realize today that only 30% of the people who take the basic skills test to get into the military can pass it? And we are not talking about higher math. But the most important threat that we face is to the fabric of our democracy. Because Americans are not held together by ethnicity or nationality or religion, most certainly not by a conception of belonging to one or another class. Americans are held together by this belief that you can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things. And if that is ever not true, then the fabric of this society will be torn apart. And people will give way to aggrievement, why don't I have, and its twin brother, entitlement, why don't they give me? And once you have given way to aggrievement and entitlement, you have lost control of your circumstances. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, segregated times. I was fortunate, as I've said, to be in an educated family. But there was a strong sense that your circumstances were not a prison. In fact, we were told, your circumstances you cannot control. Your response to your circumstances you can control. There should be no victims, and oh, by the way, you'll have to work twice as hard and be twice as good. And that was said not as a matter for debate, but as a matter of fact. I often say to my students now, it's not a bad mantra to have that you have to be twice as good, because then perhaps you really will work twice as hard. But if we've not given to the American people, whatever their station in life, the ability to break out of circumstances, then we have bought in to the Marxian notion of class. It is where you are permanently born. It is where you will permanently stay. There is no escape from it. It is what defines you. That is not the American way. Thank you very much.
Dr. Rice has agreed to answer a few questions from the audience. So I think that somebody has some microphones. So how is this going to work? Raise your hand. We're going to make it happen.
And I just finished teaching, so if nobody raises their hand, I'll call on somebody.
Obviously, you speak as well as you write. So in your book, Extraordinary Ordinary People, you refer to the reason why you think gun should be maintained in order for people to defend themselves. Yeah. I wonder if you could comment on how that fits in with your comment you just made on the fact that you just have to say that the country should give you what it says it should give you.
Yeah. Well, my view of the Second Amendment, I will fully admit, is informed by my own experiences. Now, it doesn't mean that I think you have to have assault rifles in schools, all right? So let's be clear on that. But I don't believe that you can start picking apart the Constitution and saying, oh, that number in the Bill of Rights is actually still in force and that one's not. So there's the matter of consistency, and I'm well aware that the language says in a well-regulated militia as well. Now, I grew up in Birmingham, and in 1962 and 1963, if you depended on Bull Connor's police to protect you, you were nuts, not to put too fine a point on it. And so in my neighborhood, when there were white Klan riders coming through, my father organized the men, he and several men of the community, into brigades, and they would go with their guns to the top of the cul-de-sac in which we lived, and they would take turns watching for night riders. Once in a while, they fired into the air. I don't think they actually ever shot anybody, but they did fire into the air. And I've often asked myself, what would have happened if there had been registration of those guns? Do you think Bull Connor would have let them survive? So I fully understand that this is something about which Americans disagree. I also fully understand that this is a different time than that time. But I think the framers of the Constitution were actually pretty wise, and maybe they understood that there might be circumstances in which the police were not your protection, they were your greatest fear. Yeah. Secretary Rice.
Secretary Rice, thank you for being here. The state that you live in, the same state that I live in, 45 years ago we had the best K through 12 education system in the nation, rated as #1. We also had the best state higher education system in the nation, rated as number 1. Now California's K through 12 system is 49th. Thank goodness for Mississippi.
We used to say that growing up in Alabama, too.
And our system of state higher education, although still magnificent, in fact, I teach at this university, Berkeley, which in every respect is superior to the one you teach in. Nevertheless, it is being gradually starved for funds. So the question I have to you, particularly with regard to K through 12, why did, in your view, California move from number 1 to number 49? And are there any lessons there with regard to your theme?
Yes. Well, let me just say a word about the University of California system, for which I have enormous respect. And I am out always defending it and saying that I think it's a crown jewel for the state of California, except on big game day when it's really a lousy place. But other than that, no, the UC system is really remarkable. The United States is blessed with a network of really outstanding state institutions, and they have to be preserved. When it comes to K-12, though, I think it's more than an issue of resources. I think we have asked the schools to do an awful lot. We've asked them to be the socializer of our kids. We've asked them to do social policy with our kids. We've asked them to stand in for parents who aren't there. They're just trying to do too much. And as a result, I think there's been a loss of focus on what they really need to do, which is to educate our kids. And so when I look at standards, for instance, I know there's a lot of debate about No Child Left Behind and whether or not you should have standards. I think you do have to test to know whether or not kids are doing well. I'll leave it to those who can actually design tests to tell me what a test ought to look like. But, you know, if you really can't read by 3rd grade, you're probably not going to read. And if you don't know that, you can't intervene. And yet I think standards have slipped and slipped and slipped. If I give my Stanford students low standards, they will live down to them. And I'm frankly not much for the self-esteem movement, which I think this state has way overdone. Not every kid can win a soccer trophy. I was one day helping my cousin's daughter do her math homework, and she had 9 times 5 is 40. And I said, no, that's wrong. And she said, there are no wrong answers. But yeah, there are. You know, that would be one of them. So we really do have to have high standards, and we have to test for them. Secondly, we have to have excellent teachers. I would pay really good teachers the top of the scale. But not everybody is a really great teacher. And frankly, if you're not a good teacher, find another profession, because we can't afford bad teaching. Third, and here I know it's a controversial point, but I will make it because I've come to it actually quite sadly myself. The public schools have been moving in reverse for quite a long time. There are a lot of great reformists out there who are doing a lot of great things, and I think they're starting to move back in the right direction. But it's going to take a long time. And we're losing a generation of kids every 3 or 4 years, not every 18. Because as I said, if you can't read by the time you're 3rd grade, you're not going to read. I served on a task force for the Council on Foreign Relations called National Security and Education Reform. Joel Klein, the former chancellor of the New York City Schools, was the other co-chair. And on that task force was Randy Weingarten, who is the president of the American Federation of Teachers. She was wonderful. I think she's trying. She is really somebody who tries to look forward. But when it came to the question of school choice, she said, I can't sign on to that. I said, I understand. She said, we can't have an opt-out system in our public schools. I said, Randy, we have an opt-out system. Right? If you are well off, or even of modest means, you will move to a district where the schools are good. That's why houses are expensive in Fairfax County. That's why houses are expensive in Palo Alto. People move to districts with good schools. If you are real wealthy, you'll send your kids to private schools. And then the only people trapped in failing neighborhood schools are poor people, parents who have no other way out. And that's the height of inequality. And because I think education is the new civil rights struggle, for the time being, until we can get the public schools to a point that they can deliver for every child, give that parent other choices. Charters, if necessary, a voucher to send the kid to a private school, because we can't continue to sacrifice kids on the thought that we don't have an opt-out system when indeed we do. So I think higher standards, better teaching, really pretty rigorous standards, but for the time being, we're going to have to create some competition for the public schools, the ones particularly that are bad. Mr. Nader.
By the way, I want to refer you to Cicero's definition of power, which is freedom. He defined freedom as participation in power. Mm-hmm. It's a good compass.
It is a good compass.
How do you square your rule of law, constitutional, statutory, international treaties, with the White House multiple assertions for invading Iraq? And second, how do you think the death and destruction in Iraq, which is continuing, worked out?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think history has a long arc, not a short one. And if in 1948, 58, 68, 78, or 88, you had said, here's what's going to happen. The Soviet Union is going to collapse. Hammer and sickle will come down from the Kremlin for the last time. 75 years of communism, never mind. Germany will be unified completely and totally within NATO and the West. If you'd said that in 48, 58, 68, 78, 88, they would have had you committed. Therefore, I think we have to give history a little more time. Now, let's talk about what was removed in Iraq. Saddam Hussein, whatever you want to think about weapons of mass destruction, intelligence was wrong, I fully own up to that. But whatever you want to think about weapons of mass destruction, this is actually somebody who had used them against the Iranians, against his own people in the north and in the south. This was someone who had invaded his neighbors twice, had drawn us into war twice, had put 400,000 of his people in mass graves, and was continuing to fire at American planes and British planes flying no-fly zones on behalf of the international community under a UN resolution. And so you can ask, is Iraq better off today or better off under Saddam Hussein? I can tell you I think the Middle East is better off today without Saddam Hussein. Because while we worry about an Iranian nuclear weapon, we could be worrying about an arms race between Saddam Hussein and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. That's a really ugly Middle East. So I fully accept responsibility for, as one person who was involved in the decision-making, for the lives lost, both Iraqi and American and others. But since I know that history has a long arc, not a short one, I'm awfully glad Saddam Hussein is gone. And at least the Iraqis now have a chance to build institutions that allow them to choose the people who are going to govern them, rather than being subject to one of the most brutal dictators that the Middle East has ever seen. And oh, by the way, if you think it was a humanitarian intervention to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, who threatened his people, how can you not consider it humanitarian intervention to get rid of Saddam Hussein, who used weapons of mass destruction and put 400,000 people in mass graves? So I'm perfectly comfortable with that decision. Thank you. And oh, by the way, under a UN Security Council Resolution 1441 that threatened serious consequences, and under a resolution passed by the United States Congress. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
In terms of class warfare, I was wondering if you could, so I appreciate the emphasis on education in terms of where you come from doesn't mean where you're going. You know, I came from a background where I grew up in a very rural environment myself. In addition to education, which has really made an incredible impact in my life, I was wondering if you could talk, and I'll ask you to talk about some more controversial issues in terms of, are there specific policy recommendations you would make in terms of whether it's social programs, tax policy, like, because to me, education, yes, we all should be better educated. That seems very non-controversial. What are some of the more, some of those more political things? What are your specific policy recommendations around those?
Well, I touched on one in answer to Secretary Reif. Look, school choice is controversial. It's quite controversial. But I don't see an option when poor parents are stuck in bad schools and their kids are stuck in bad schools. It's also the case that we actually spend a lot of money on education, turns out, K-12 education. So the question is, how are we spending that money on K-12 education? Is it actually getting into the classroom, or is it feeding bureaucracy? I would look very hard at that. I think you have to look at and this is controversial within my own party. I happen to believe in the Common Core and national standards. Now, there are those who say local control of education. I'm all for local control of education, but nobody should be able to argue that the child in Birmingham, Alabama, and the child in Oakland, California, and the child in Highland Park in Dallas, Texas, shouldn't know the same thing. And so while some would say the federal government should have no role in education within my party, quite controversial to argue that, in fact, you ought to have common standards, common core, where all Americans essentially know the same thing. One final point, and here I'll make a really controversial point, and it's really about not just K-12 education, but it's also about the way universities have been teaching. One of the reasons that I think we have difficulty with civic education is we no longer operate from a common core knowledge of text, of the important ideas that essentially created the basis for American institutions. I was provost of Stanford. Stanford had a humanities curriculum. We tried to reform the curriculum because the dead white men had been kicked out of it in 1968. And while it is wonderful, absolutely wonderful, to know what a peasant thinks someplace, it actually hasn't had nearly the effect on human history that those dead white men did. That is not a normative statement. That is a statement of fact. And so if you don't have your students read Rousseau, and you don't have your students read Plato and Cicero, and you don't have your students read Locke and Hobbes, why are you surprised that they are totally ignorant of the institutions that are the foundational institutions of the United States of America? And so I think getting back to a rigorous education around a common set of, a common knowledge, around common knowledge, would actually make a very big difference, not just to the rigor of the educational system, but also for Americans to our common understanding of how these institutions became what they are and how we, as citizens of them, are to exercise them. Yes. One more? Yes, all the way in back.
Okay.
Yeah, you? Okay.
Back to the question about the common knowledge. And as a scientist, I just wonder, like, what's your thought on teaching evolution and creationism in school? Yeah.
Well, look, I think that evolution ought to be taught in schools. I happen to be a deeply religious person, and I don't happen to see a conflict between belief in whether you want to call it intelligent design or creation, and what has so far been discovered about evolution. You know, I have good friends who are scientists since I live at a university. And the observations, as I understand it, there are observations that would lead one to understand evolution. There are observations that would lead one to understand the origins of the universe, but they are observations. Well, that too, but they are observations that are actually quite far apart from the final narrative about what really happened. And so until somebody proves to me differently, I happen to think that that narrative includes something that we are unable to see, something that perhaps we are unable to understand. I mean, quoting Piaget, it is difficult to understand an intelligence that is higher than oneself. And since I believe that there is a God whose intelligence is an intelligence higher than myself, I don't see a conflict between these two. And I would never argue for teaching creationism, but you know, this is a country that allows people to hold their beliefs. And one had better be very careful about telling people that they can't teach their children about their own views of the origins of human life. Tom?
Rice.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.